Welcome back yet again, gang. This is part 4 of our Chapter 20 lecture series for your textbook, Give Me Liberty by Dr. Eric Foner. This section is entitled Culture Wars. The focus question for this section is what were the major flashpoints between fundamentalism and pluralism in the 1920s? Much of the impetus behind the conservative turn in American politics in the 1920s can be linked to a phenomenon that many historians have dubbed the Fundamentalist revolt, or what could be arguably said could be the third Great Awakening in American history. During the 1920s, many evangelical Protestants came to embrace a form of religious fundamentalism, not quite the same as political fundamentalism, but very closely linked, as a response to the increasingly modern and secular world. These evangelical Protestant fundamentalists believed that the literal truth of the Bible formed the basis of Christian belief. And this was really a backlash against what many saw as the modernization of Christianity, as some Christian churches were more open and accepting of some of the more liberal social ideas emerging in this period, which many Christians saw as a violation or betrayal of fundamental Christian principles. By and large, this fundamentalist turn in evangelical Protestantism reflected and supported the larger conservative turn in mainstream American society and politics. Evangelical Protestant fundamentalists strongly supported the enforcement of prohibition and identified modern notions of freedom with immorality and a decline of Christian liberty. And really, fundamentalist Christianity remains a significant socio-political force in American society whose influence has waxed and waned over time, but has always been there since this time as an influence in American politics and social relations. Most significant and famous, or perhaps infamous, manifestations of Christian fundamentalism in the United States during the 1920s was the Scopes trial, also known as the Scopes monkey trial. And this was an episode where fundamentalists led an attack on teaching Darwin's theory of evolution in public schools. And a teacher by the name of John Scopes was actually recruited by the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, to purposely defy a Tennessee law against the teaching of evolution in order to test the law's constitutionality. And there was a very famous trial that took place around this case. And fundamentally, the issue at hand was two competing definitions of freedom. The fundamentalists believed in this idea of moral liberty, which they defined as the voluntary adherence to traditional religious belief. Voluntary being the operative word there. Scopes defenders, including the ACLU, maintained that freedom meant the right to engage in independent thought and individual self-expressions. Now, while John Scopes did lose the trial, his attorney, Clarence Darrow, embarrassed the fundamentalist defense at trial by revealing their ignorance of science. And this picture right here shows an episode from that trial where Clarence Darrow, you see right here, is put William Jennings Bryan, who was the defense attorney, on the stand and tested his knowledge both of the Bible and of science, which he failed miserably and pretty much embarrassed himself in front of the public. And although Scopes lost the trial legally, because of Clarence Darrow's very intelligent and articulate defense, the fundamentalist position in American society and legitimacy to many was greatly reduced, and fundamentalists remained in retreat for many years after this very public defeat at the hands of Clarence Darrow and the ACLU. The 1920s also saw a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, this was more tied to anti-immigrant sentiment than it was to anti-black sentiment at this time, although, of course, anti-black sentiment was a profound and important part of Klan ideology. In 1915, the Klan was reborn in Atlanta after the lynching of a Jewish man who was accused of murder in Atlanta at the time. And the Klan quickly became a national movement, not just in the South. In fact, in many ways, it was more popular in the North and the West than it was in the South in the 1920s. States like Indiana, Ohio, Oregon, California had huge numbers of Klan members, many of them prominent members of their communities. And the movement was entirely mainstream and generally reflected the majority values of the time, something that is very hard for our modern minds to wrap our heads around, but also reflects the profound changes in majority of opinion that have occurred between then and now. And an example of just how mainstream this was, this picture here shows a Ku Klux Klan march that's right in front of the U.S. Capitol building in the 1920s. Ku Klux Klan members in the 20s were politically connected and claimed to stand for pure American values, which meant targeting blacks, immigrants, feminists, labor organizers, Jews, and Catholics. This anti-immigrant sentiment that was reflected in this resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan was also reflected in immigration law and policy itself in the 1920s. There was a fundamental change in immigration policy with the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act, and this law was driven by existing prejudices against immigrants, coupled with the fear that immigrants brought with them political radicalism like anarchism, socialism, communism. This law established quotas for European immigrants and barred the entry of all those deemed ineligible for naturalized citizenship, for example, Asians. It also established the category of illegal alien for the first time, as well as a border patrol force. The 1920s also saw a heightened emphasis on race in general as a determinant of public policy, especially immigration. Now, as we have discussed several times before, the concept of race in the early 20th century was not just a black and white issue, but an ethnic issue as well. And these new sciences like eugenics, which we have discussed in previous lectures, fostered new ideas of creating a biologically ideal population. And Congress applied these scientific calculations to determine new quotas, but these calculations were not really backed by any real data. And this exposed what many saw as a double standard at the time. And courts in the 1920s actually admitted there was no scientific basis for the concept of race, and tacitly admitted that race was indeed a fully social construct. However, due to the majority opinions at the time, this admission did not matter, and race retained its scientific trappings in the early 20th century. As I have stated already several times in this lecture, for every action there was an equal and opposite reaction. And during the 1920s, the conservative views on race and culture faced liberal pushback. And this is represented in part through Horace Kalin's idea of cultural pluralism, which emerged at this time. And this idea described a society that gloried in ethnic diversity rather than attempting to suppress it. And in many ways it reflected and was an extension of the melting pot concept that emerged during the Progressive era. And this idea of cultural pluralism challenged the idea that some immigrants were not fit for citizenship. And new immigrants themselves offered a defense of pluralism and this idea of Americanization, essentially by osmosis, that the mass consumption of consumer goods and mass American culture like movies, radio and music acculturated immigrants to American culture and ideas. And many new immigrants embraced the loosening of patriarchal bonds which defined the social worlds of many immigrant groups and the expansion of freedom, but they were against the coercive aspects of Americanization programs. They wanted to voluntarily adopt these American cultural symbols rather than having to be forced to do so by the government. Immigrants at this time embraced these ideas of cultural pluralism and the sense of tolerance that such ideas invoked. And this led to the manifestation of phenomenon that some have dubbed the hyphenated American. And, the idea that immigrants did not have to completely cast off their cultural trappings and cultural beliefs, that they could Americanize while still retaining some of their unique cultural characteristics at the same time. And this self-identification as ethnic Americans, this idea of being Italian American or Irish American or German American, things of that nature. In general, court cases during this period began to broaden the meaning of freedom and created a constitutional foundation for pluralism and the right to privacy. And courts began to overturn laws that restricted immigrants' freedoms. The 1920s also saw black culture explode into the mainstream of American society for the first time in American history. During this period, there was a general upsurge of self-consciousness among black Americans, thanks in no small part to the Great Migration we discussed in a previous lecture, and the rapid increase of African Americans, particularly in northern urban areas. And Harlem became kind of the center of this African-American diaspora from the South, and Harlem saw a huge influx of Southern African-Americans and West Indians, those from the Caribbean of African descent, due to this great migration. And in many ways, Harlem became what could be termed the capital of black America, and this unleashed a phenomenon that historians have termed the Harlem Renaissance, and where there was this tremendous surge in African American art and culture based out of Harlem, but quickly spreading exponentially outward from there. Black authors, poets, artists, and musicians made immense contributions to the American literature and arts rooted in the black experience, and provided the foundation, particularly in music, for jazz, blues, rock and roll, and pretty much every form of popular music that has come after it. And with that, we conclude part 4 of our Chapter 20 lecture series. Don't go anywhere. One more part to go. Until then, study hard, and I'll see you soon.